Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace, the only platform worth considering when you're ready to start that next great website. Look, everyone out there on the internet is making something these days. We no longer just look at the internet, we make it ourselves. And if you've got a great idea for a website, well, when it's time to move that project from your head to the screen in front of you, there's only one place you should go, and of course it is to Squarespace. Maybe the hands-on type with lots of opinions and ideas about what exactly your website should look like. If that's the case, great. Squarespace gives you all the customization options you could ever want with no updates, no patches, no technical BS to worry about. Or maybe you just need something functional, something that works with minimal thought so you can stay focused on the content and not the coat of paint. Just use one of their quick, beautiful templates to make a website that's fresh and simple. And once you're done setting up your website, locking in the name, maybe playing with some of the colors, there are so many extra features that Squarespace provides so your site can thrive. Email campaigns, patronage portals, social integrations, member-only areas, analytics, commercial options, 24/7 customer support, everything you need really is in one place. So when you're ready to get started on the next project of yours, big or small, if it involves a website, it's got to be with Squarespace. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/brainfood to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now today's video. Challenging someone to a duel in some fashion or another has been around seemingly as long as humans have been humaning, and most likely even before that, with even our animal brethren exhibiting similar behaviors when fighting over a mate, food, watering hole, or the like. As humans, however, while at times our general methods of such a challenge mimic every bit as much, for example, apish chest beating over our sexual partner, over the centuries we've developed a variety of alternate means of expressing that we'd like to punch someone in the face. Sometimes we use words, in other cases a symbolic action. Perhaps one of the most famous of such actions was allegedly taking a gauntlet and tossing it down on the ground before your foe. But did anyone actually ever literally do this? While many a medieval trope we cling to in modern times has a little basis in actual historic behaviours, as we've covered countless times before, such as with the alleged medieval chastity belt or the idea of a real-life chivalric knight rescuing a damsel in distress, it turns out that the literal tossing of a gauntlet or glove before your opponent does seem to be something that was a thing, or at least we have countless references to the practice, not just in stories, but even some official decrees and the like. As with the expression, the French seem to have coined it, and from there popping up in its English variant sometime in the ballpark of the 16th century, such as from Nash Pasquale's 1590 Apology, in which is stated, "I cast the my gauntlet, take it up, who dares?" Or in William Hine J. Bruin's 1641 A Faithful Remonstrance of the Holy Life and Happy Death of J. Bruin, in which he states, "And casting out his gauntlet of defiance, he challengeth them all." As to when exactly this all became largely figurative isn't totally clear, with some of these early instances perhaps being accounts of such, but definitely at least by the 18th century or so, when laws against dueling and trial by combat likewise started to become a thing, as we'll get into shortly. Noteworthy here, before this, the refusal of a duel could even find your name published in local newspapers, insulting both your honour and also potentially implying guilt in something given your unwillingness to fight for the fact that you were in the right. Needless to say, things are kind of getting out of hand on that front, and the governing bodies decided that it was time to step in. In any event, as for the first documented reference to something like this literal throwing down the gauntlet practice, although not the exact meaning or implication, it appears in Virgil's masterpiece Aeneid. In it, a boxer by the name of Dares is more or less challenging any man enough to get all naked and sweaty and touch body parts with him, while everyone else watches during a classic battle of fisticuffs. Eventually, Entellus steps forth and, just before explicitly throwing down his robe and revealing his glistening nude body, throws down something else, with Virgil writing, "He threw two ponderous gauntlets down in open view, gauntlets which irks wont in fight to wield, and sheath his hands within the listed field. With fear and wonder seized the crowd beholds the gloves of death, with 7 distinguished folds of tough bull hides, the space within is spread with iron or with loads of heavy lead." Dares himself was daunted at the sight, renounced his challenge, and refused to fight. Ultimately, this fight did commence, and while Dares initially held his own, he eventually had to give up, though he only did so after being persuaded by Aeneas, when Aeneas realized if Dares did not give in, Entellus was going to kill him. Unhappy with not getting to kill Dares directly after, Entellus walked over to a bull and punched it in the head because, well, apparently why not? Crushing its skull, he stated, "In Dare's stead I offer this. Irks accept a nobler sacrifice." Burn. Fast forwarding to the ballpark of medieval times, and the gauntlet in some form or another had become a relatively common piece of battle gear among knights and others. And for whatever reason, the act of taking your gauntlet off and tossing it at the feet of your foe to issue a challenge had thoroughly become a thing. As to why, it's not totally clear, but the leading hypothesis is simply that, as putting on a gauntlet was part of getting ready for battle, and it is relatively easy to take off in the moment, taking it off and throwing it at the feet of your opponent was perhaps more or less you saying, "Here, put this on and get ready for a fight." And indeed, simply throwing the gauntlet down was only half the act here. In order to accept the challenge, your foe would do so by picking the gauntlet up. Whether that's actually what anyone was thinking originally or not, we have many references to the practice, such as in Edward Hall's 1548, the union of the two noble and illustre families of Lancaster and York. In it, he states that whosoever would said that King Richard was not lawfully king, he would fight with him at the utterance and threw down his gauntlet. A much more famous depiction of this appeared in Shakespeare's Richard II, in which King Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, never one to use words when kicking ass and taking names would suffice instead, accused Duke Thomas Mowbray of being a traitor and challenged him to a duel to decide the matter, stating, "Pale trembling coward, there I throw my gage." Mowbray then replies, "I take it up, and by that sword I swear, which gently lay my knighthood on my shoulder, I'll answer thee in any fair degree or chivalrous design of knightly trial, and when I mount, alive may I not light, if I be a traitor or unjustly fight." Speaking of a knightly trial to determine guilt on something, this sort of trial by combat was also absolutely a thing, and at points in history, even legally binding in some regions, going back to around the 7th century CE and Germanic law becoming a relatively common practice in Europe throughout the 16th century. With the general thought process being God would be on the side of the person in the right, so they would, of course, win, regardless of whether it was a David versus Goliath type context. By the early 8th century, trial by combat had been codified, including in the Lex Alamanorum, 1712 to 1730 CE, and the Frankish Merovingians and the Carolingians had set out capitularies on the practice by the turn of the 9th century. In the 10th century, Otto the Great officially sanctioned the practice for the Holy Roman Empire, and in 1230, its legal codes, the Sachsenspiegel, identified it as a key method for establishing innocence or guilt, particularly for claims of injury, theft, or insult. According to the Sachsenspiegel, the parties were provided with swords and shields and were prohibited from wearing helmets, shoes, or heavy gloves. Although it's not always clear what would happen to an accuser who didn't show up at the appointed time, presumably in most cases the accused would be deemed innocent, if the accused failed to appear, that individual was deemed to be guilty. In one noteworthy Flemish trial in the 12th century, Guy of Steenvoorde was found guilty of treachery after he was defeated by Iron Herman in a particularly painful fashion. To quote, "The prostrate Iron Herman gathered strength and slyly made Guy think he was certain of victory, meanwhile having raised his hand very smoothly to the lower edges of the mail coat, where Guy was unprotected, and grabbed him by the testicles and threw him from him, breaking open all the lower parts of his body. And so the prostrate Guy grew weak and cried out that he was defeated and was going to die." Wager of battle, as the practice was called in Britain, was probably introduced by the Normans, and the first recorded battle, Wulfstan and Walter from 1077, occurred after the conquest 1066. By the next century, the Tractatus of Glanville, 1187, an English legal treatise, suggested the practice was the primary mode of trial, at least among the nobles. However, by 1219, and perhaps to comply with the Magna Carta 1215, jury trials were becoming more common, and trial by combat began to slowly fall out of vogue in Britain. That said, it was still around, and in one 1251 case between the Abbot of Meaux and the Abbot of St. Mary's in York, each holy man paid for a champion to represent him, like a lawyer, but with brawn instead of words. During the trial between the champions, despite the fact that Meaux had paid much more for a generally considered superior fighter, as it began to look like his man could lose, the two clergymen quickly settled their dispute before the fight ended. This particular trial by combat illustrates a couple of important things about such trials in their practical use. To determine guilt or innocence at this point in history. First, contrary to what is generally depicted in film and TV shows, trial by combat was not always a lethal affair, and often combatants specifically used weapons like quarterstaves or the like, which wouldn't necessarily cause any permanent harm, though of course could potentially if a fight proceeded to the conclusion of one fighter being completely incapacitated. However, either fighter could at any point simply give up if things got a little too dangerous for their liking. Sometimes accepting the drawbacks of losing was a preferable scenario to continuing to fight and potentially be killed. Further, the combat sometimes didn't even happen at all. Once the two champions were set, if one side or the other was at a significant advantage, matters might have been settled out of court as a result. And even if the trial by combat went forward, the individuals involved in the dispute could in some cases decide to settle it before the fight ended, depending on how the fight was going, as happened with the Abbots. It's also important to note here, once again, that it was presumed at the time that God would help the individual whose cause was just in the physical fight and ensure that person's or their champion's victory. Further, if one wanted to accuse someone of something in a court of law, as Justice John Bailey noted in the famous 1880 case Ashford and Thornton, in which Thornton requested trial by combat to prove his innocence, thanks to trial by combat, the party who institutes the trial must be willing, if required, to stake his life in support of his accusation. In any event, going back to gauntlets and the actual issuing of such a challenge, at some point, as the wearing of many other types of gloves became a thing, particularly among the wealthy or otherwise elite, the practice also morphed into not throwing the glove on the ground, but instead pulling your glove off and slapping your prospective foe in the face with it as a way of issuing a challenge. Who first got the bright idea to do this isn't clear, but one can imagine tossing your rather expensive and otherwise probably mostly clean glove on the ground might not have been ideal, nor did it quite signify getting ready for battle as tossing an armored gauntlet would. And anyway, smacking people in the face who deserve it is much more satisfying. In this case, even if they don't accept the challenge, well, at least you got to smack them in the face. Whatever the case there, while the literal tossing of a gauntlet or glove down on the ground to issue a challenge has more or less gone the way of the dodo, what hasn't is the expression throwing down the gauntlet, which is alive and well and is a way of issuing a challenge, albeit often in modern times, generally less about fighting a duel or the like, and more about perhaps a boss throwing down the gauntlet to its team of lazy writers who aren't churning out scripts fast enough. Thus, one could throw down the gauntlet that they really should get back in the basement and continue pecking away at their keyboards like the monkeys that they actually are, lest said boss get out the cat o' nine tails. I mean, hey, at least you got to slap them in the face. Now, seemingly related expression to throwing down the gauntlet is that of running the gauntlet, more or less meaning someone making their way along an extremely painful or otherwise difficult path, taking a beating on all sides in the process of getting to the other end. So, what does any of this have to do with gauntlets, and did this ever literally happen in the past? Well, as to the latter question, yes, this was totally a thing throughout history, and it was extremely brutal in many cases, except it had absolutely nothing to do with gauntlets at all. So, why the expression? Well, it's a verbal typo, more or less, that just caught on, literally. We'll get to that in a moment, but for starters, references to people being made to run or stand in place between other people intent on beating them to a bloody pulp as they go basically goes back as long as humans have been humaning, because humans are apparently awesome. As to specifically calling it running the gauntlet, while the English word gauntlet has French origins, the gauntlet in running the gauntlet is from the Swedish gatlop, which in turn was from the Old English gantlope, meaning lane or course or passageway, which makes a lot more sense. Some early references of this and the practice include the Earl of Shaftesbury's 1646 diary, in which he writes, 3 were condemned to die, 2 to run the gantalope. Just a couple of decades later, English people were already getting the original word wrong in favor of a more familiar, similar-sounding word, as well as using the expression figuratively, such as in Joseph Glanville, 1661, the vanity of dogmatizing. Quote, to print is to run the gauntlet and to expose oneself to the tongue's strappado. That said, the gantalope version in English was still a thing all the way through the 19th century, but as that word became more and more archaic, the much more familiar word gauntlet gradually sparsed it completely, despite it not actually making much sense from a literal perspective. Noteworthy here, not just our old world selves got in on this fun, there are references to Native American tribes also doing this, which all brings us to the absolutely badass story of frontiersman Simon Kenton, who in his early 20s found himself a captive of the Shawnee and subsequently showed a level of physical endurance few in history have ever matched up against. As for this harrowing tale leading up to it, Kenton had been aiding the American Revolution in their attacks on the British and their Native American allies, including the Shawnee, among whom Kenton had become quite hated. Thus, pretty much the first thing the tribe did to Kenton after capturing him was to tie him to a tree and then slap him in the face with the severed scalp of one of his moments before alive friends. They followed this up by stretching him out on his back, painfully binding him in such a way that he was unable to move at all, and then beating him bloody. When this didn't kill him the next day, they tied him to a wild horse and then whipped the horse such that it bucked around through trees and bushes, trying to rid itself of its unwanted passenger. Noteworthy here is that Kenton was tied in such a way that if he were to fall off the horse, he would be strangled. However, Kenton not only managed to stay on the bucking horse bareback, but the horse eventually became tired of the whole thing and just endured its rider, at which point the thoroughly battered and bloodied Kenton was cut loose. After surviving that ordeal the next day, they made him run the Gauntlet with 2 parallel lines of members of the tribe around a quarter mile, about half a kilometer long, all armed with sticks to beat him with. This one came with a potential out though. If he managed to make it to the other side without getting knocked down, a rare feat of feet, his fate would likely get better, with the tribe needing to decide what to do with him from there, which at least would no longer be death, but could be anything from being adopted by them to a prisoner exchange, or perhaps having him turned over to the British for them to do with the revolutionary rebel as they pleased. Unfortunately for him, after a couple of attempts, he was not able to make it to the end without being knocked down, but unlike many in his place, he at least didn't die. It was at this point that the tribe began taking him around to show him off at various villages, with which he would, once recovered enough each time, be made to run the Gauntlet again for those tribespeople to have a chance at beating him and maybe even kill him. After several such runs over time at different locations, he decided to simply escape the Gauntlet by bowling over an old woman and running off into the woods. And while he did eventually outrun the tribe chasing him, he had the misfortune of running right into a group, including one Chief Bluejacket, who were on their way to see the famed prisoner get the crap beat out of him. He was subsequently smacked over the head with a tomahawk as he attempted to flee the group, putting a literal dent in his skull, which his biographer noted that he had for the rest of his life. The blow kept him unconscious for over a day, but once sufficiently recovered, the beatings continued, with him ultimately running the Gauntlet at various locations an astounding 8 times and surviving them all. And we can't stress this enough. This sort of thing, even one time, was supposed to be fatal. As if you were knocked down, the general thing was for everyone near to converge on you and beat you until dead. By accounts, they did the former each time, but the whole dying part just wasn't happening in this case. Given his unwillingness to die, it was finally decided to simply tie him to a stake and light him on fire. They subsequently did the first part of this, but right before setting him alight, a random cloudburst occurred, drenching Kenton and the tinder. The young man survived another day. The next day, as luck would have it, a close friend of his, Simon Gertie, who as a youth was captured and raised by the Shawnee, showed up and, seeing his friend about to be killed, managed to persuade the tribal leaders that they should spare Kenton's life. From there, it was reported by author Edna Kenton that the warriors gathered about him, each heartily shaking his hand, each calling him brother, each expressing admiration of his bravery, his running, his leaping, his cunning, his pride of spirit, and from there, Kenton was adopted by an old woman to replace a slain son. Unfortunately for him, while he enjoyed a few-week reprieve in this state and slowly recovered from all of his injuries, some tribesmen arrived at the village Kenton was staying at and became extremely upset to learn that one of their former most hated enemies had been allowed to not only live, but also become a member of the tribe. They thus demanded that he be executed. This group was eventually able to sway the rest, and Kenton was once again sentenced to die. On his way to the village he was to be executed in, where members of many tribes could come to attend, he was variously beaten along the 50-mile march, suffering a broken arm and broken collarbone in the process. Before the burning at the stake, he was once again made to run the Gauntlet for his 9th and final time. Once again, whatever fates may be were on his side. Not only did he survive this run, one Chief Logan, who allegedly admired Kenton, decided to send a runner to the British to see if they might send someone to bargain for Kenton and take him as a prisoner instead of having to kill him. This was done, and on the day he was to be burned, a trader and translator, Pierre Drouard, dressed as a British officer, showed up on behalf of the British, ultimately managing to convince the tribe to hand over Kenton as a prisoner of war on the promise that after he was interrogated by the British, he would at some point be returned to the Shawnee to be executed. In exchange, the natives were given whiskey, tobacco, and various other goods. From here, Kenton was given proper medical attention for the first time in all of this. Unfortunately for him, this included having his arm rebroken in order to set it right. In the era of no anesthesia or anything of the sort, this action would have basically been indistinguishable from the original act that caused it to break in the first place. Otherwise, Kenton's time with the British seems to have been pretty relaxed, with him even being allowed to roam around down to an extent, making the most of his time there with an eye on his future escape and getting back to the Patriots, also known as dastardly traitors. Kenton subsequently paid close attention to the British goings-on there, including even attending council meetings. While doing this, he secretly began gathering supplies for his escape, including food, a rifle, and stashing them outside a town in a hollowed-out tree. Finally, after several months, he made his move, taking 2 fellow prisoners with him for the journey through enemy territory. 400 miles and 30 days through the wilderness later, they successfully arrived at the Falls of Ohio in safety. The 24-year-old young man from here had a rather distinguished life, including becoming a brigadier general and fighting in the War of 1812, living to the ripe old age of 81. So there you have it. Yep, throwing a literal gauntlet down does appear to have been a thing people historically did to issue a challenge to someone, with the challenge being accepted by picking up the gauntlet. And on the flip side, the completely not related at all running the gauntlet was also a thing. In this case, rather than one human wanting to beat the crap out of another human, many humans grouped together to beat the crap out of one human. From all of this, I think we can agree a universal and immutable fact throughout history is that humans are dicks. But also can surprisingly go the other way too, and more as we have progressed in our humaning, as illustrated by this running story by the pinnacle of non-dicks, the great Mr. Fred Rogers, stating in a commencement speech that he gave, quote, "I wonder if you've heard what happened at the Seattle Special Olympics a few years ago. For the 100-yard dash, there were 9 contestants. All 9 of them assembled at the starting line, and at the sound of the gun, they took off. But one little boy stumbled and fell and hurt his knee and began to cry. The other 8 children slowed down, turned around, saw the boy, and every one of them ran back to him. One little girl with Down syndrome bent down and kissed the boy and said, 'This will make it better.' The little boy got up, and he and the rest of the runners linked their arms together and joyfully walked to the finish line. They all finished the race at the same time. People who were there are still telling the story with obvious delight. And you know why? Because deep down, we know that what matters in this life is much more than winning for ourselves. What really matters is helping others win too, even if it means slowing down and changing our course now and then. So maybe in future moments in which you may wish to throw down the gauntlet at some foe's feet, instead perhaps try remembering that's not being the person Mr. Rogers knew to be. As the great man himself summed up, there are 3 ways to ultimate success. The first is to be kind, the second is to be kind, the third way is to be kind. Unless, of course, some dude besmirches the honor of your female, then definitely that's a punch in the face.